One small thing changed everything. A flight attendant refused to help an elderly woman with her seatbelt, treating her like she didn't matter. What she didn't know was that the woman wasn't just any passenger, she owned the airline, and by the time the plane landed, the flight attendant would have to deal with a fallout she hadn't seen coming. Before we start the story, let us know where in the world you're watching from today, and if you like stories like this, don't forget to. If you want to make sure you never miss a new video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. As the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, an elderly woman named Leora Wells walked onto the plane, carefully walking down the aisle while holding a small purse. She was wearing a simple beige coat and had her silver hair pulled back. Her eyes were quiet and wise, like someone who had seen a lifetime of change. Her movements were slow but steady, and her steps were deliberate. She walked toward the business class section without rushing because there was no need to. When she got to her seat, she put her purse gently on the armrest and sat down with a sigh. The seatbelt was next to her, but the buckle was just out of reach. She reached out and tried to grab it with one hand, but her fingers shook a little, making it hard for her to do. She looked up and saw the view. A flight attendant named Cassie Monroe stood a few rows ahead, talking animatedly with a group of first-class passengers. She was tall and poised, with blonde hair in a perfect bun and a spotless uniform. She carried herself with an air of competence that often turned into arrogance, deciding who deserved her best service and who didn't as she laughed lightly at something a well-dressed man had said. Her eyes briefly flickered across the cabin and then moved past Leora without a second thought. Leora cleared her throat. She gently spoke into Cassie's ear. "Excuse me, dear, could you help me for a moment?" When that didn't work, Cassie turned her head, her polite smile faltering for a split second as she realized who had called for her. There was a flicker of irritation on her face that was subtle but clear. She looked at the unbuckled seatbelt and let out a quiet sigh. "It's just a seatbelt, ma'am," she said with a forced smile. "You just need to pull it across and click it in," Leora replied with a small nod. She barely hid her impatience as she glanced around to make sure no one important was paying too much attention. "I'll be back in a moment," she muttered before turning back to the conversation she was having before. The young man sitting next to Leora Ezrin Cole, who was in his early 30s and wearing a dark sweater, had been watching the whole thing. He exhaled as his sharp eyes flickered between the elderly woman and the flight attendant. He put his hand over his nose and leaned over a little. "I can help," he said in a low voice. He reached across and fastened the belt for her with a quick click. Leora smiled at him and said, "Thank you, son." Ezrin smiled back, but there was a hint of discomfort in his face. He had seen how Cassie brushed her off. He wasn't the only one who noticed. A few other passengers turned away as if they hadn't seen anything. No one spoke up, and the plane continued to fill with people. As the last people found their seats and the overhead compartment snapped shut, the same flight attendant walked down the aisle checking on others. As she passed Leora's row, she barely glanced in her direction. Instead, she smiled brightly at a businessman next to her and asked if he needed anything before takeoff. Then she moved on without a second look. Leora stayed quiet, her hands resting gently on her lap. She didn't say anything else, demand attention, or complain, but the way she was still carried a weight. A man in a dark suit in first class couldn't have missed it. Callum Vance hadn't said a word and hadn't drawn attention to himself, but his sharp eyes took in every detail. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed back, and his navy tie was knotted perfectly in place. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and typed a message. And just like that, the flight's course had changed, but Cassie Monroe didn't know it yet. The engines roared to life, and the plane took off. As the plane sped toward the runway, people settled into their seats, adjusted their armrests, and read magazines. There was a quiet hum of conversations, the rustling of pages, and the distant clinking of glasses from the first-class section. Leora Wells sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out the window. As the plane gained speed, she could feel Ezrin Cole looking at her from time to time, as if she was still upset about what had happened. He moved around in his seat and adjusted his seat belt before finally speaking. She should have helped you, he said under his breath. Leora turned her head slightly and smiled. People show who they are in the smallest moments, she said gently. No need to correct them, life will do it for them. Ezran leaned back and let out a soft breath. He didn't know why, but something about her words made him uncomfortable. There was no anger or bitterness in her voice. It was like she knew exactly how this flight was going to go. At the front of the plane, Cassie Monroe moved through the first-class seat cabin, checking on the VIP passengers. Her voice was warm, her smile bright, and her whole attitude was different from just minutes before. She leaned down a bit as she spoke to Mr. Blackwell, the well-dressed man in his 50s. Can I offer you another drink? She asked, her tone smooth and professional. He nodded and lifted his empty glass to say, another whiskey please. She smiled and said, of course, I'll bring that right away. The intercom buzzed softly above her, and the captain's voice came through the speakers, calm and steady. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign has been turned off, and you are free to move around the cabin. Our crew will begin service shortly. As soon as the announcement ended, Cassie sped to the galley to get the drink ready. She poured the whiskey into a crystal glass, added a single cube of ice, and made sure it was just right before putting it on a tray. As she was about to go back to first class, one of the junior attendants, Maya Dawson, hesitantly walked into the galley and said, Hey Cassie, in a low voice. Did you see the passenger in 7B? The older woman was having trouble with her seat earlier. Cassie barely looked at her as she adjusted the tray. Yeah, what about it? She asked. Shouldn't someone have helped her? Mara asked. We don't have time to babysit every single passenger. People should be able to handle something as simple as a seat. Cassie laughed quietly. Mara frowned slightly, but didn't argue because she had only been a flight attendant for 6 months and knew not to question a senior crew member. But something about Cassie's attitude made her uncomfortable. She had seen how the woman treated first-class passengers differently than people she didn't think were worth her time. She brushed off the thought as she picked up the tray and made her way back to first class, where she delivered the drink with another bright smile before saying she was sorry. She felt completely at ease as she walked down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor. She had no idea that something had already been set in motion that would change how this flight ended. At that very moment, in the cockpit, the flight supervisor got a call from the airline's executive office. The voice on the other end of the line made him stiffen a little as he listened to the message, which was short but clear. There was a VIP on board, and it was a very important one. How the flight crew treated this passenger would be closely watched. The mood inside the cabin stayed the same, with the quiet murmur of passengers mixing with the hum of the engines. The flight attendants moved through the aisles serving drinks and taking requests. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, at least not to Cassie Monroe. She walked past business class without a second glance, her attention solely on first-class service. She was sure she hadn't done anything wrong by helping an elderly woman with her seat belt. Wasn't her job, especially since there were more important people to take care of. But back in business class, Leora Wells stayed calm, her fingers tracing the seam of the armrest, and her face was blank. Ezran Cole sat next to her, watching his flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, not paying any attention to her. A few seats away, a middle-aged woman named Elaine Porter leaned over to her husband and whispered, Did you see how she ignored that woman earlier? That's what I saw. But what can you do? People don't speak out about these things unless it directly affects them. Elaine pursed her lips and looked over at Leora, who sat there unfazed, almost as if she wasn't waiting for anyone to apologize or be kind. There was something about Leora's presence that made Elaine uneasy, not because she seemed upset, but because she wasn't. She carried herself with quiet authority, as if she knew she didn't have to ask for respect to be given. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, in the cockpit, the flight supervisor, Oliver Raines, stood by the radio panel and listened to the other end of the call. His face was expressionless, but he was carefully thinking about what was going on. Yes, sir, he said in a sharp voice, I understand. I will handle it right away. He then looked up and met the captain's gaze. Captain Miles Harding was an experienced pilot who had flown thousands of flights, but the seriousness on Oliver's face made him sit up straighter. "What's going on?" the captain asked. "We have a VIP on board." Oliver took a deep breath before speaking. The captain squinted at the VIP in seat 7B, and Oliver hesitated before answering. "Leora Wells." Just hearing that name sent a shockwave through the cockpit. Captain Harding leaned back in his chair and pressed his fingers against the armrest. "Are you telling me that Leora Wells, the owner of this airline, is sitting in business class and no one on this crew knows about it?" Oliver grimaced. The room fell into a heavy silence. This wasn't a misunderstanding, there was a major problem. The captain let out a heavy breath. Oliver shook his head and said, "Not yet, but they will be." He reached for the intercom and hovered his finger over the button, but before making the announcement, he asked, "Do we have any reports on how she's been treated so far?" There was a pause, and then Liam Foster, one of the communications officers, hesitated before answering. "I received a message from one of our staff monitoring the flight remotely saying that she asked for help with her seatbelt earlier." The captain frowned, and Liam cleared his throat. There was a long pause, and the words weight filled the cockpit. The captain's face darkened, and he still didn't answer her. Oliver looked at the passenger manifest, scanning the list of crew members assigned to this flight. His eyes fell on one name, Cassie Monroe. "Well," the captain muttered, shaking his head. "Someone's about to learn a lesson they won't forget." Meanwhile, Cassie went about her normal routine, unaware that her actions, or lack of actions, had just been reported directly to the top. Just a few minutes from now, her name would be called over the crew's internal intercom, and the rest of the flight would be different. The soft chime of the crew intercom cut through the quiet hum of the aircraft. Cassie Monroe barely noticed it at first because she was too busy topping off a champagne glass for a first-class passenger with her signature smile. Then she heard a voice say, "Cassie Monroe, report to the galley immediately." The announcement was firm. Even though it wasn't mean, the tone of the message unnerved her. She blinked and looked around. It wasn't unusual for a crew member to be called, but something about the tone of that message made her uncomfortable. She brushed the thought off and turned back to the passenger in front of her. "Apologies, sir," she said, "I'll be right back." She set the bottle down and made her way to the galley, her heels clicking against the floor. Inside the small crew area, Oliver Wayne stood waiting, his arms crossed over his chest. Dawson, the junior attendant standing near the quarter, moved uncomfortably and avoided eye contact. This wasn't a casual conversation. Cassie walked into the galley with practiced ease, but something in her gut told her to be careful. "You needed me?" she asked in a forced polite tone. Oliver didn't waste any time asking, "Do you know who's sitting in 7B? Her brows knitted together at the sudden question. What 7B business class elderly woman with silver hair and a beige coat? His voice was cut off, leaving her speechless. There was no room for confusion, so Cassie crossed her arms over her chest and frowned. "Oh dar, I know who you mean." "What about her?" Oliver's eyes hardened, and the words didn't register at first. "I don't the Leora Wells," Cassie said, blinking and shaking her head slightly. His voice dropped lower. "The founder and owner of this airline." She caught her breath. The galley was dead silent, and the only sound was the quiet hum of the engines. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her mind went back to the time Leora had asked for help. She had walked away from her and ignored her like she was nothing more than a bother. She had ignored the owner of the airline she worked for. The realization hit her like a weight on the chest, and her stomach twisted as the full weight of her mistake hit her. Oliver carefully watched her reaction before continuing. "The executive team has been notified, and the captain is aware that they're watching how this flight is handled from now on," he said, taking a step closer. "I need to know exactly how you interacted with Mrs. Wells, leave nothing out." Cassie's mind tried to come up with a response, but her instincts took over. "I didn't do anything wrong," she quickly said. "I was just having trouble with my seat. Belle, it wasn't a big deal." A scoff came from the corner for Maya Dawson, who had been quiet until now. She let out a quiet breath and shook her head. Oliver, you were there. Marira hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. She looked at Cassie, and then back at Oliver before nodding. I saw what happened, she said in a soft voice. Mrs. Wells asked for help, and Cassie walked away. I was busy, she said, hesitating for only a moment before answering. You had time to chat with first-class passengers. The words hit Cassie harder than she expected, and her usual confidence began to waver. This isn't just about ignoring a passenger, it's about ignoring the wrong passenger, Oliver said, exhaling slowly and shaking his head. And now you're going to fix it, she said, swallowing hard and clenching her fists. What do you mean you're going to walk away? She had to go back to 7B and personally apologize. Oliver told her to do it right away, with no excuses and no attitude, because if she didn't, she wouldn't be able to get this job again after we landed. The warning was clear, she had no choice but to follow it. She took a shaky breath and turned toward the aisle. The walk back to 7B felt heavier than any step she had ever taken. People around her barely noticed her, some were reading or dozing off, but she felt like she was being watched as she approached Leora Wells. Leora Wells was quietly flipping through a magazine, as if she knew this moment was going to happen. Cassie Monroe swallowed her pride, steadied her breath, and got ready for the moment she never saw coming. Cassie Monroe stopped next to seat 7B, her breath uneven as she forced a tight smile and clasped her hands in front of her to look calm, but the weight of what she was about to do hit her like never before. Leora Wells didn't acknowledge her right away. The woman in front of her kept reading the magazine in her lap, her face calm and almost indifferent. Cassie hesitated. She had spent years in this job controlling situations with ease, but now she wasn't in charge, and the woman in front of her hadn't needed to raise her voice or demand respect, but somehow Cassie felt smaller than ever. She cleared her throat softly and finally spoke. Mrs. Wells, I wanted to apologize for what I did earlier. Leora turned the page of her magazine without looking up to see what Cassie said. Cassie was surprised because she thought Leora would forgive her right away with a simple nod so she could walk away and pretend this never happened. Instead, Leora's voice was patient, and the tone was almost amused. Cassie shifted on her feet and said, I'm sorry I didn't help you when you asked for help. Leora hummed softly, still not looking at her. I see. She turned another page as if the conversation wasn't particularly important. Cassie's fingers twitched slightly. I didn't mean to ignore you, she quickly added. I was. Leora raised a hand to slightly silence her. Think carefully before you speak. Continue that sentence. She finally lifted her eyes, and Cassie felt her stomach tighten. There was no anger or hostility in her eyes, but there was something else that made it clear that whatever Cassie said next would define this moment forever. Cassie swallowed hard for the first time in a long time. She didn't have anything clever to say and couldn't quickly talk herself out of it. The truth was that she had ignored Leora because she thought she wasn't important. Leora carefully studied her. Cassie hesitated. You were busy, were you? You had time to pour drinks, make conversation, and check on passengers you thought deserved your attention, Leora said. Leora's voice stayed steady, not harsh, but firm. But when an elderly woman asked for help with something as simple as a seatbelt, you decided she wasn't worth your time. The words hurt Cassie in a way she hadn't expected. She had heard complaints before and even been scolded by supervisors, but this was different. Leora's eyes held no. Esran Cole, the man sitting next to Leora, suddenly chuckled under his breath. Cassie looked at him with narrowed eyes and snapped, something funny, before she could stop herself. Esran raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his seat. I just think it's interesting how you only care about apologizing now that you know who she is. Cassie stiffened, the words hit her harder than she wanted to admit. Leora finally put down the magazine and rested it on the table. She let out a soft breath as if the conversation had already gone on for too long. Apologies don't mean anything when they're only given out of fear, she said. Cassie felt her throat tighten. She thought Leora would scold her, demand better treatment, or even ask for a formal complaint to be filed. Instead, she was making her sit in her own mistake, forcing her to admit why she had ignored her passengers. Elaine Porter, the middle-aged woman, had started to notice the exchange. A woman sitting across from Cassie nudged her husband Warren, whispering, "I'm not letting her off easy." Cassie could feel the stare's silent judgment. It was the same thing she had done to other people. Leora's voice broke the silence again. "You should return to your duties, Miss Monroe." Cassie's face burned as she said it. "I said," Leora repeated. "You should return to your duties." Cassie clenched her fist, her pride telling her to say something to defend herself, but she knew there was nothing left to say. Without another word, she turned sharply and walked away faster than usual, her heart racing, and shame settling deep in her stomach as she disappeared into the galley. Leora reached for her cup of water and took a slow sip before looking at Ethan. "I'm not going to forget this flight," he said, shaking his head. Leora's lips curled into what looked like a smirk, and she said, "No, I won't." What Cassie didn't know was that this was just the beginning of what was waiting for her when the plane landed. Monroe stormed into the galley, her breath shaky, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her heart was racing with anger and shame. She had been in tough situations before, with messengers complaining and bosses scolding, but she had never felt so helpless. She replayed the conversation in her mind, Leora Wells's words pressing down on her like a vice. It wasn't just an apology that was turned down, it was a lesson she wasn't ready to learn, and the worst part was, many people on board had seen everything. The junior flight attendant, Mara Dawson, hesitated before asking, "Are you okay?" Cassie gave her a sharp look and snapped, "I don't need sympathy." Mara shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't back down. "I wasn't offering sympathy. I was asking if you understand what just happened," Cassie said. "I understand perfectly. I got scolded by some old woman who thinks Maya flinched. You might want to stop right there." Cassie stopped moving when she heard Maya's warning. "Check, not just some old woman," she said quietly. "She's the reason we have jobs. She built this airline from nothing, and you fired her like she was nobody." Cassie clenched her teeth and turned away. She wanted to argue to defend herself, but the truth was clear. Before she could answer, a soft chime went through the crew intercom, and a familiar voice spoke with a weight that sent ice down Cassie's spine. "All senior flight attendants report to the galley." Right away, Maya's eyes widened a little, thinking, "That's not normal." Cassie stiffened and said, "No, it wasn't." A few seconds later, two other senior flight attendants, Nathan Hayes and Isa Grant, walked into the galley, exchanging uneasy looks. Oliver Raines, the flight supervisor, walked in behind them, his face unreadable. He didn't waste any time, telling them that all crew interactions with Mrs. Wells would be reviewed upon landing. This made Cassie's stomach drop, Nathan frowned, and Oliver's jaw dropped. Tightened by the board of executives, there was a thick silence in the galley. Cassie's heart was racing. This wasn't just about Leora Wells turning down her apology, it was bigger than that. Nathan rubbed the back of his neck and asked, "Why didn't she even complain?" Oliver exhaled through his nose. "She didn't." He turned to look at Cassie, but someone else did. Cassie's heart skipped a beat as she asked, "Who are you?" Oliver's eyes didn't waver. Case froze. That name carried weight. Callum Vance was a powerful businessman with ties to the airline industry. He had been sitting in first class the whole time, watching everything without being noticed. Now he spoke up. Oliver went on to say that he sent a direct message to corporate explaining how one of our crew members publicly fired the owner of this airline. His eyes became sharp, and now everyone on the ground is waiting to see how this is handled. Cassie felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't just embarrassment anymore. This was the end of her career. Nathan and Isa looked at each other uncomfortably, and then at Cassie. They both knew at that moment that this flight wasn't going to end like any other. Oliver adjusted his uniform and said, "I advise everyone to do their job properly and professionally for the remainder of this flight," pausing to say, "Especially you, Cassie." Cassie clenched her jaw and barely nodded. Oliver turned toward the door and hesitated before looking back at her. His next words were colder. when we land, you're going to have to answer for everything. Made Cassie's hands curl into fists at her sides. She thought this was over, but she was wrong. The plane kept cruising through the sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. It felt different, heavier, as if something unseen was just beyond the horizon. Cassie Monroe stood frozen in the galley, Oliver Wayne's words pressing against her like a storm ready to break. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find a way to fix this, to make things better before things got even worse. Mary Dawson stayed near the drink station and cautiously looked Cassie's way. Nathan Hayes and Isa Grant, two other flight attendants, exchanged quiet words, both keeping their voices low. They knew something Cassie hadn't fully admitted to herself yet. This was more than just a mistake. In the cabin, people were starting to notice the tension. Some whispered, while others kept their heads down to pretend not to hear the quiet conversations going on around them. A few people, including Ezra Cole, Elaine Porter, and even Warren Porter, were paying attention. Elaine leaned toward her husband and whispered, "It looks like I just realized my life is over." Warren sighed and shook his head. She should have thought about that before she acted like she was above everyone else in 7B. Leora Wells sat comfortably sipping her water. She hadn't asked for attention or demanded justice, but everything was falling apart around her, and she wasn't the least bit surprised. Ezen Cole took a quick glance at her. Leora smiled lightly, but didn't answer right away. She tilted her glass slightly and watched the water swirl inside. "People show their true character when they think no one is watching," she finally said. "But someone is always watching." Ezen let out a shaky breath and shook his head. "She's panicking now." Leora's smile didn't fade. "Good, let her." In the galley, Cassie was also panicking. She grabbed a napkin and pressed it between her fingers as she paced in the small space. "What am I supposed to do?" she muttered under her breath. Cass's head snapped toward Mira. "Excuse me," and she said, "Maybe you should stop worrying about how to fix this and start thinking about why it happened in the first place." Mira didn't back down, she just ignored her because she thought she wasn't important. Cassie shook her head and said, "You decide who's worth your attention and who isn't, and today, it just happened to backfire." Cassie's fingers tightened around the napkin, her jaw clenching. "I was doing my job," she said. Mira replied, "You were doing your part of the job, and now you're about to find out what happens when you underestimate the wrong person." There was a tense silence between them until the crew intercom buzzed again. It was Captain Miles Harding's voice, telling everyone, "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and cabin crew prepare for landing." Cassie swallowed hard as the reality of the situation hit her. Mira adjusted her uniform better. She said quietly, "Get ready, because whatever happens when we land, you won't be able to walk away from it." Cassie didn't answer, she just stared ahead, her heart racing because she wasn't sure if she'd even have a job by the end of the flight. As the plane started to descend, the cabin shook and the familiar chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the air. Cassie Monroe stood near the galley and gripped the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing that was keeping her steady. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her. She couldn't read their faces, but the silence was worse than any scolding she had ever gotten. She had always thought she was untouchable, but now she wasn't so sure. Mary Dawson, who was near the service station, adjusted her uniform and stole a glance at Cassie. "You should probably sit down before landing." Cassie gave her a blank look but didn't say anything because she knew it wasn't worth arguing. As she slowly made her way to the front of the cabin, she saw Oliver Wayne talking quietly with Nathan Hayes near the entrance to the flight deck. She couldn't hear what they were saying but could tell it was about her because Nathan shook his head and pressed his lips together in a firm line. Oliver then turned his head to meet her, as if sensing her presence. Cassie quickly turned away. She had never been one to avoid conflict, but this time, the consequences felt too real. She kept walking through the business class section, and her eyes caught on Leora Wells, who was sitting still and looking out the window in 7B. She hadn't said a word since their conversation because she didn't need to, the damage was already done. Next to her, Ezra Cole was watching Cassie carefully, but she couldn't read his face. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to keep moving because she could feel the tension in the air. People around her were tense. People who hadn't paid attention to her before were now sneaking glances and quiet nods. Cassie wasn't hidden anymore, she was out in the open. She made her way to the jump seat near the front of the cabin and sat down with stiff muscles. As soon as she did, she let out a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't how the flight was supposed to go. She had gotten on the plane completely in control, but now she wasn't even sure she'd be able to step onto the plane. Callum Bance sat across the aisle with his arms crossed, eagerly observing the last moments of the flight. He had done what needed to be done. He had made the call that started everything off, and Leora Wells hadn't asked him to, she hadn't needed to. Some people demanded respect, Leora had commanded it without saying a word. As the plane dipped lower, the city lights below got brighter, the intercom sparked back to life, and the captain's voice stayed steady as usual. As the cabin crew got ready for landing, Cassie Monroe tightly gripped the armrests. The flight was almost over, but her problems were just beginning. The landing gear dropped with a soft thud, and the cabin started to vibrate slightly as the plane slid toward the runway. Passengers braced themselves for the landing, some gripping their armrests and others barely noticing because they were still scrolling through their phones. Cassie Monroe, on the other hand, felt every second stretch out into eternity as she sat stiffly in her jump seat with her hands locked together. Her lap with her nails pressing into her palms. Her mind was racing with the worst possible outcomes, each one worse than the last. Would she be scolded, suspended, and fired on the spot? Leora Wells hadn't even filed a complaint. This was happening without her permission. What was even worse was that someone else, Callum Bance, a man with a lot of power in the industry, had told corporate about it. When someone like him called the executive office, people listened. The plane's tire screeched against the runway, sending a short jolt through the air. It slowed down to a steady roll, and the voice of the captain filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. It's 3:45 p.m. here. Please stay seated until we get to the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us today. Cassie barely heard the words because she was so scared. She wasn't stupid, she had worked as a flight attendant for years and seen flight attendants get pulled in for performance reviews that they never come back from. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist as the plane took off. As the plane taxied toward the gate, she dared to look at 7B, where Leora Wells was sitting comfortably, her face blank, as if she hadn't just ruined Cassie's career with the snap of her fingers. Ezrin Cole, who was sitting next to her, checked his phone with a small smirk on his face, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen. Cassie felt sick. The flight attendants worked quickly to get ready for arrival, unbuckling passengers' restraints and doing last-minute checks. Oliver Rames, the flight supervisor, stood near the front and spoke. Cassie knew better than to ask Nathan Hayes what they were talking about because she knew it was about her. The plane stopped at the gate, and the seatbelt sign went off. Right away, people started grabbing their things from the overhead bins, which kept popping open one by one. Cassie stayed still, and then she saw them through a small window near the front of the plane. Two uniformed security officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, their faces blank. Cassie's breath caught in her throat. A lump formed in her throat when Oliver finally turned to face her. His face didn't say much, but his voice was firm. Keeping it professional, he said, "You need to come with me." Her stomach dropped, and she stood slowly, her legs feeling unsteady under her. She could feel the weight of the whole cabin's attention shifting toward her. As she walked past 7B, she forced herself not to make eye contact with Leora Wells, but just as she did, she heard Leora's. Not looking up from her magazine, she said, "I told you. People always show who they are when they think no one is watching." Cassie's throat tightened because now everyone was watching. Cassie Monroe forced herself to keep walking, even though each step felt heavier than the last. The murmur of passengers filled the cabin, their voices quiet but clear. She knew what they were whispering about. She didn't have to look to know that Ezrin Cole was watching, that Elaine Porter was nudging her. Even the first-class passengers, who normally didn't pay attention to what was going on outside of their section, knew something was wrong. Leora Wells sat there reading another magazine page and looked as unconcerned as ever. Cassie clenched her jaw and walked through the galley to find Oliver Raines waiting for her. "Come on," he said in a neutral voice. She swallowed and nodded, following him out the door. As soon as the door opened, the cool air of the jet bridge hit her, but it did. There was nothing that could calm the storm inside her. Two security officers stood there, and while they were rude, didn't grab her, or spoke in a harsh voice, just being there was enough. Cassie could feel the eyes of every crew member burning into her back. Oliver stepped aside, gave her one last unreadable look, and then said, "They'll explain what happens next." Cassie's heart was racing. She stopped talking when she realized her voice was too shaky. She cleared her throat and straightened her back. Was this necessary? One of the officers, a tall man. A man with a shaved head, didn't flip the bird. "The executive board has requested a formal review of your conduct on this flight. You will be escorted for questioning." Cassie's nails dug into her palms, and she took a deep breath. She knew this wasn't an auction. After taking one last look at the plane, she stepped onto the jet bridge. As soon as her feet hit the carpeted walkway, she realized she was being escorted off the plane like a problem that needed to be fixed. The cabin was still full of. She knew that the people getting their bags would remember this flight for a long time after they got off the plane. The security officers walking next to her made it clear that this wasn't just a normal meeting with management. Cassie wanted to go back and explain herself, but it was too late. As she got closer to the terminal doors, she saw a group of executives standing near the private meeting rooms. One of them was James Holloway, who was one of the airline's top decision-makers. Cassie Monroe had ignored Leora Wells because she didn't know who she was, but Callum Vance had known the whole time and was now standing next to her, her stomach turned. Callum Vance was here to watch what happened next. Cassie forced herself to stay calm, swallowing the lump in her throat. She didn't know what was waiting for her in the meeting room, but she did know that this wasn't going to end well. The walk through the terminal felt like the longest of her life, and the steady buzz of airport chatter surrounded her. As her passengers shuffled to their gates and the flight crews moved purposefully, it didn't feel real. Two security officers stood on either side of her, but they didn't touch her or rush her. They made it clear that she wasn't going to run away from this. Her eyes darted to James Holloway, the senior airline executive waiting just ahead. He stood tall, his sharp eyes fixed on her, and his hands clasped behind his back in a way that showed he had already made up his mind. There was also Callum Vance, the businessman who had seen it all. He had been quiet and watching from a distance, letting Cassie dig her own grave. Now he was standing next to the airline executives, and Cassie couldn't read his face. She swallowed hard. She couldn't get away from this. One of the security guards pointed to a private conference room. Inside, several high-ranking airline officials were sitting around a long table, their faces grim. As she walked in, her flight supervisor stepped in behind her, and Cassie felt her stomach twist. She slowly sat down in the chair at the far end of the table. The room was eerily quiet for a moment before James Holloway spoke. His voice was smooth but sharp. "Miss Monroe." He started flipping through a file in front of him and asked, "Do you have any idea why you're here?" Cassie licked her lips. She hesitated. She wanted to defend herself by saying it was all a misunderstanding, but she knew that wouldn't work because they had already made up their minds. She moved in her seat. James raised an eyebrow at the passenger and lightly tapped the folder. "You mean Leora Wells?" Cassie caught her breath. James continued to flip the file closed and said, "Let's start with the facts. We received a direct report from Callum Vance, who personally witnessed her interaction with Mrs. Wells." He pointed to Callum, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. Cassie resisted the urge to look at him. James leaned forward slightly and said, "Let's be clear, Mrs. Wells didn't file a complaint." She didn't. Oliver was still standing near the door, and James's eyes flicked to Cassie, whose fingers were curled into fists under the table. "Miss Monroe," James slowly breathed out, This airline was built on one thing: customer service. Everyone who steps onto our plane deserves to be treated with respect, whether they're young, old, rich, an economy passenger, or someone you thought wasn't important. Cassie felt her face burn, and James leaned back to ask, "Miss Monroe?" If Mrs. Wells hadn't been the owner of this airline and had just been a regular passenger, would you have even cared? The question hit her like a slap, and she knew the answer. The room was silent as Cassie tried to come up with a response. She could feel her career slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, there was nothing she could do to stop it. James looked at one of the executives, and then back at her. "We'll be making our final decision soon. Until then, Miss Monroe, you are officially placed on." As soon as James closed the file in front of him, he told Cassie, "Unpaid suspension effective immediately." This was her worst fear coming true. Cassie wanted to argue and beg for another chance, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had already made her decision, and now she had to live with it. As the security officer stepped forward, she forced herself to stand, her legs shaking. She had once thought she was untouchable, but now she knew she wasn't. She wasn't sure if she'd ever step foot on another plane again when Cassie Monroe walked out of the conference room with 2 security officers standing on either side of her. The fluorescent lights of the terminal suddenly felt too bright and the noise of passengers too loud. She had never been escorted out of an airport like this before. Her legs felt weak, but she had to keep walking because she had to. As she walked past the waiting area near the private lounges, she saw Leora, the last person she wanted to see. Wells, the old woman, was sitting in a soft airport lounge chair drinking tea, as if she hadn't just seen Cassie's career fall apart right next to her. Ezen Cole, on the other hand, was leaned forward, scrolling through his phone with a faint smirk on his lips. Elaine and Warren Porter weren't far away, sneaking looks at Cassie as she walked by. She could feel the weight of their stares, but Leora was the one who really made her stomach twist because she wasn't bragging, she was just watching, which made it worse. Cassie really wanted to say something to defend herself, say sorry, and say that she wasn't responsible for what happened, but she couldn't because she knew it wasn't Leora Wells's actions that had ruined her career, it was her own. Leora took another slow sip of her tea before finally speaking. "I hope this moment stays with you," she murmured without looking away. Cassie's breath caught, not because of the words, but because they weren't said with anger or cruelty. They were said with certainty. Leora must have known that Cassie would remember this flight for the rest of her life, because Cassie's jaw tightened and her nails dug into her palms as she forced herself to keep walking. She didn't look back because she knew that if she did, she might break, and she wouldn't let them enjoy seeing that happen. The security guards led her through the terminal, past the crowded gates, past the busy flight crews getting ready for departures, past the world she used to belong to, and as she walked out the airport doors, it finally hit Cassie Monroe that she wasn't just leading the airport, she was leading everything she had worked for behind, and there was no going back. As she stepped out into the cool air outside the airport terminal, reality set in. The automatic doors closed behind her, sealing her fate. The world inside her had gone on without her for years, and she had worn the uniform of pride, sure that she was in charge and could choose which passengers to let through. Were worth her time and which weren't, now that she wasn't wearing it at all. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone and, as she usually did, unlocked the screen. But there were no messages, no calls asking where she was, and no reassurance from a supervisor telling her this was all a misunderstanding. She had always thought of herself as indispensable, but in the span of a single flight, she learned the truth: she had been replaceable the whole time. Cassie sat down on a nearby bench and pressed her fingers to her temples. The terminal door opened and closed every few seconds as people came and went. They were carefree and moving forward, but she couldn't yet. Her career had been built on a false sense of power, the idea that as long as she knew the right people, she could do whatever she wanted. She had put businessmen in first class and executives with expensive suits and bags ahead of Leora Wells, and that was her biggest mistake. She took a slow, shaky breath. Would things have been different if she had only taken 5 seconds to do her job? Would Leora have let it go? Cassie knew the answer. The old woman had never asked for special treatment, praise, or punishment. What was worse was that Leora hadn't even had to do anything. Cassie had hurt herself. Her fingers were curled around the edge of the bench as she stared at the ground beneath her feet. Her mind was racing. Could she fix this? Was there a way to undo what had been done? As the thought crossed her mind, she heard a voice say, "Sabine, your head snapped up." Leora Wells was standing a few feet away. She wasn't in a hurry, and she wasn't surrounded by security or executives. She was just watching her. Cassie's throat tightened as she tried to say something, but she couldn't. Leora stepped forward with the same quiet grace she had shown the whole flight. There was no malice in her eyes, and there was no sign of triumph in her face. It hurt Cassie's chest that Leora sat next to her instead of anger, disappointment, or some other final verbal blow that would solidify her downfall. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were car horns, rolling suitcases, and distant announcements. Finally, Leora broke the silence. "You're not the first person to misjudge someone," she said simply. "And you won't be the last." Cassie swallowed hard and stared straight ahead. "I didn't," she said. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Leora said, letting out a weak breath and tilting her head slightly. "Didn't you?" Cassie flinched at the question. Leora didn't sound mean when she said it. She wasn't accusing her, but she also wasn't lying either. Cassie clenched her teeth and rubbed her hands over her face. "I was doing my job," she said. She tried. Leora stopped her and said, "You were doing your version of your job," which Cassie understood. She did her job the way she wanted to, not the way it was supposed to be done. She made her own rules about who was worthy of her service and who wasn't, and now she was paying the price for it. Leora let out a soft sigh. "You have a choice, Miss Monroe." Cassie looked at her with doubt. "A choice?" Leora asked. "You can let this moment break you, or you can let it change you." Cassie's throat tightened. "If I wanted to fix it," Leora said. "Start by seeing people, not just the ones you see." Cassie Monroe let out a shaky breath and looked down at Leora Wells as she slowly stood up and adjusted her coat sleeves. "Good luck, Miss Monroe," Leora said. Cassie Monroe felt the words sink in, and as she watched Leora Wells walk away, she realized something. This moment would stay with her forever. The question was what she would do with it. Cassie Monroe sat on the airport bench long after Leora Wells had disappeared into the crowd. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her like an invisible force, squeezing her breath. The world around her kept going as usual, with people coming and going, families greeting loved ones, and business travelers rushing to their next destination. But she was stuck. The job she had started with competence, thinking she could do no wrong, had now given her nothing for years. She had snubbed some customers because she thought they weren't important, and she had picked and chosen who should get her attention, acting like her job gave her that power. She had spent so much time looking down on other people, but the person who brought her to this point, Leora Wells, had never looked down on her, not even now. Leora had to look down on her, glow. She hadn't demanded punishment, and she hadn't even needed to say much, because Cassie's actions had been enough to destroy her. Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench, and her knuckles were turning white. Could she come back from this? Would the airline ever let her step? Although she had a lot of questions, one thought would not leave her mind. Leora's last words, "You can let this moment break you or you can let it change you." Cassie let out a sharp breath and shook her head. Was there even a way to change? At this point, she had lost everything. What was left to save? Suddenly, she heard a familiar voice say, "Didn't expect to see you still sitting here." This made Cassie snap her head up. Ezen Cole stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her with the. She frowned and asked, "Why do you care?" Ezrin shrugged, "I don't really." He walked over and sat down next to her on the bench. "But I am curious," she said. Cassie let out a bitter laugh about how badly I crashed and burned. Ezrin smirked. That part was definitely entertaining. She yelled at him, but he didn't seem fazed. He kept stretching out his legs and saying, "I'm not here to kick you while you're down." You did that well enough on your own. Cassie laughed and crossed her arms. Great, thanks for the reminder, Ezrin. Looked at her with a fading smirk. You know, most people would have just said sorry and moved on. Cassie tensed up and said, I did apologize, but Ezrin corrected her. You apologized because you had to, not because you meant it. His words hit her deep, and she didn't want to admit it. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. Let me ask you something. If Leora Wells had been a random passenger and not the owner of the airline, would you have cared about what happened? She stopped talking because the real answer was staring her in the face. She wouldn't have cared. She would have walked off that plane, forgotten about what happened, and gone on with her life, never thinking twice about the old woman who had just needed help. Ezrin saw the realization on her face and nodded. Nah, that's what I thought. Cassie let out a frustrated sigh and ran her hand through her hair. Why are you even here? Ezrin leaned back and shrugged. I was waiting for a car and saw you sitting here. I'd see if you had a big plan for revenge or something. Cassie rolled her eyes and asked, revenge on whom? Ezrin laughed. Fair point. There was a moment of silence. Cassie looked down at her hands and asked, do you think she was right? Ezrin gave her a sideways glance and asked, yes. Cassie hesitated before answering. People show who they are when they think no one is watching. Ezrin slowly breathed out and nodded. Yes, I do. Cassie bit her lip and clenched her chest. What did I reveal? Ezrin simply said that you thought you were. The words hit Cassie like a punch because they were true. Ezrin looked at her for a moment before shaking his head. But here's the thing, people can change. Cassie laughed out loud. Tell that to the airline that just suspended me. Ezrin shrugged. Maybe they're giving you a chance to figure it out. Cassie blinked, his words hitting her hard. She had been worrying about what she had lost the whole time, but she hadn't thought about what she could still gain. Even more than getting her job back, Cassie wanted to become someone who deserved it. She took a slow breath and realized, for the first time since getting off the plane, that this didn't have to be the end of her story. Maybe it could be the start of something better. Cassie Monroe sat in silence and stared at the airport floor as Ezrin Cole's words lingered in her mind. Maybe they're giving you a chance to figure it out. Not everyone gets that she had spent. She had spent her whole life thinking she was untouchable and that her job security came from being able to deal with first-class passengers and make the rich and powerful feel important. But she had never thought about how important it was to treat everyone with respect, not just the ones she thought were worthy, and that was the lesson she had never been willing to learn until now. Ezrin stood up and stretched his arms before looking down at her. Well, this was fun, but I have a car waiting, he said. Cassie laughed and rolled her eyes. Yeah, I'm sure this was the best part of your day. Ezrin smiled and said, you'd be surprised to see karma work in real time. Cassie gave him a mean look, but this time there wasn't as much anger in it. He took a step toward the curb but stopped. For what it's worth, he said, putting his hands in his pockets. You could actually do something with this if you wanted to. Cassie narrowed her eyes and said, do something with what? Ezrin shrugged. Your second chance. Cassie laughed dryly. That's right. Chance. Ezrin tilted his head slightly and said, it could be if you stalk sulking long enough to figure it out. Before she could answer, he gave her a lazy two-finger salute and walked toward a black car that was idling near the curb. The driver opened the door for him, and he was gone without saying a word. Cassie slowly let out a breath as she leaned back against the bench. For the first time in a long time, her mind was racing. She didn't have a plan, a sense of control, or a clear idea of what would happen next. But this moment seemed to matter more than any flight she had ever worked. While she was staring at the blank screen on her phone for what seemed like forever, she had been expecting messages from coworkers, people talking about what had happened, or supervisors explaining the final terms of her punishment. But there was nothing. It was almost as if she had been erased from that world completely. Her throat tightened. Had she really been that unimportant? Had she spent all these years thinking she was important only to find out that no one cared? The thought sent a sharp pang through her chest. She kept thinking about what she had lost and how her life had ended the moment she got off the plane. Where she could take Wells' words and do something with them. Cassie took a deep breath and steadied herself. You can let this moment break you, or you can let it change you. She had a choice, and for the first time, she didn't want to make the wrong one. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she pulled up the airline's internal system. She had access for mail. She scrolled through the directory past supervisors and coworkers who probably didn't want to work with her anymore until she found the name she was looking for. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button, Maya Dawson. Of all the people on that flight, Mira was the only one who had told her the truth without any hesitancy. Cassie had fired her, but she didn't think Mira would even pick up the phone, so she pressed it anyway. The line rang once. Mira answered twice, which surprised her. There was a pause before her voice came through, cautious, but not mean to Cassie. Cassie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and she said, "Hey, I need to talk." Mira hesitated, and then she said, "About what?" Cassie looked around at the airport, at the people walking by, and at her life, which she had taken for granted. She took another deep breath, and she thought about how to be better. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then Mira's voice softened, "I'm listening." Cassie closed her eyes. She closed her eyes for a moment. This wasn't the ending she had hoped for, but maybe it was the start of something better. If you liked the story, please hit the like button and let me know what you thought in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.